Welcome to Wayward Writers. I'm Heather Cashman.
I'm Stephanie Bearce.
I'm Nicki Jacobsmeyer.
And I'm Brad R. Cook.
We're excited today to have author Brad R. Cook with us. We're going to discuss story graphing. So, Nicki, will you tell us more about Brad?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, Brad is the author of historical fantasy and award-winning short stories. He began as a playwright and dipped into the corporate writing world, and then he served as co-publisher and acquisitions editor for Blank Slate Press. He currently serves as the historian of the St. Louis Writers Guild after 3.5 years as president. He learned to fence at 13 and has never set down his sword, but prefers to curl up with the century-old classic. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're glad you're here. So can you, when I read your bio, because we know each other through St. Louis Writers Guild and the Missouri Writers Guild, and I knew about the fencing, but I did not know about the playwriting. So can you share how, like, you went from playwriting to editing to acquisitions, historian, and all that for us?
It is a very long, complicated tale, but I will try and condense it. So essentially, that's how I got my start. I had a wonderful elementary school teacher who did these little books that were amazing. They were basically picture books that we drew ourselves and did the story ourselves and all that. So that's my door in. Get to high school, and there's a playwriting class. And I'm like, okay, I love writing at this point, but I have no idea what to do with it because I'm a high school kid. But my play got selected, and it was performed, and I got to star in it, but I also got to direct it, which was more important to me. And more importantly, I got to sit there and listen to my words on stage. And when you have someone else performing your work, it's magic. There's just something amazing to it. It's a horrible play. It's all about death and suicide and like craziness that every high schooler thinks is like really hard hitting. But it put a bug in me. And then I jumped into the theater and I helped write another play. And then I get into the real world and I'm like, there isn't a lot you can do with a play. At that point, there wasn't even a lot of contests you could enter if you were an unknown playwright. And so it was like, let's try writing over here. And so I went to corporate and did IT work and started writing business papers and white papers and tech manuals and all that really boring stuff. But it taught me how to write in a time frame and get deadlines and all that kind of stuff. And then basically I decided I wanted to be a writer, try and do it for real. And through St. Louis Writers Guild and Missouri Writers Guild conferences and all of this kind of stuff, I met up with the owner of Blank Slate Press, which was at the time a small literary press here in St. Louis. It was an amazing press, loved it, and they needed people. So I joined on and became a partner. It was a blast. I've never had more fun than being a publisher. It is a wonderful thing, and I got to be an acquisitions editor for a while, and that was amazing because that allowed me to see thousands of pieces of fiction. Most of them literary, historical fiction, some science fiction, just some amazing work. And then I had to find the diamond in the rough. That was my job. And I acquired like 12 books in my time or something like that. I loved each one of them. And then they got bought out by another company. That's what happens in publishing. And I decided to actually go full-time into writing. And that's when I published my first novel, which is a steampunk novel. It's a trilogy of steampunks, which I adore. I love history. And that really became the basis of a lot of my writing, but I love fantasy and all of that kind of stuff too. So steampunk was like a natural fit, and it was exploding at the time. So it was like, woohoo! Love those books, had a blast doing them, and I've just been weaving my way through the industry ever since. That is a really condensed version of half my life.
That was amazing, though. You really cliff noted that, Brad.
Thanks.
Okay, I have to ask, though, being an acquisition editor, what perspective did that give you now that you're a writer? Do you feel like you look at the process differently since you had that experience before you went full time? And how so?
Yeah. So one, it taught me to write not for a market, but how to write books that would reach the market. I started to learn what's important in a book, not just the story and everything like that. There's also the way it's told, the way the words unfold, the way the story goes. The first few pages are super important. It was that kind of thing that really hit it home, because it was, what am I looking for in a book that I'm trying to acquire? Now as I'm writing a book, I know what to do, I know what people are looking for, so I need to make sure everything I was looking for in a book is in my book. That's really what it taught me.
That's cool. That makes sense. Going back to the history, was there a particular moment in history or a historical figure that just made you fall head over heels?
So I love this question, by the way, and my usual answer has always been Alexander the Great, who was the guy that I wrote in. He's in my steampunk novels. He's very heavily there. And I've always, as a kid, been like, it'd be a heck of a party. He's a great guy. It'd be crazy. But now that I know more about him, I've written a book about him and stuff, I'm like, man, that would be a crazy party. And I don't know if I'd survive. I'm less a little there. And now I have to say that currently, like right now, if you were to ask me, it's Agent 355 of the Culper spy ring, which is George Washington's spy ring in the Revolutionary War. And the reason she is unknown, we don't know her identity other than Agent 355, so that would be cool to find out just who she is. Most likely she was a servant or a socialite somewhere in society, in the kind of upper echelons of British American society. And she's instrumental in capturing Benedict Arnold and winning the war and all of this kind of stuff. Plus, she'd know a lot of info about George Washington, and that would just be too much fun. I love George Washington. Right now, I would totally go for her as my favorite historical figure right now, just because I'm really curious about her. And I've been doing a whole series of these historical fiction short stories that are going to be popping up here, and I'll be releasing as we move forward in the year. And I've been grabbing onto these people in history to write this kind of historical fiction. The first one's called the Battle of Salga, and it's this amazing moment in history, in Portuguese history, that I love, which is where the inhabitants of this small island in the Atlantic basically defeat the Spanish and help win the war. It's a great thing. But because of that, I've been picking through, and one of the ones I picked through is the Agent 355, because I love the idea of her defying all convention for the time and really helping to win the war.
Stephanie knows a thing or two about spies, doesn't
I was just saying, I love her too, Brad. And I was
awesome.
Yeah, so I'm right there with you. And
Love
I
that.
love it that she was so good. Nobody still knows who she is.
I know,
So-
right?
So you have to write that book, and I'm going to read it. I can't wait. Cannot wait.
I love how your background in history definitely influences your writing, and it sounds like you're very inspired by history. Does it also affect your writing style and the themes that you explore in your books?
Definitely. Even in my contemporary stuff, I love to add in little touches here and there. Part of it is I mostly write for younger people, at least I did. Now I'm starting to write more for adults, but in the beginning I was writing mostly for young adults, and history's boring. Like, the history you get taught in school is so boring, everyone ignores it. But history's exciting, and there's so many amazing stories in history. So, in the end, what I really want to do is give those tidbits of history out. Those little just gems that are just so beautiful, you want to hear it, and you want to go, oh my god, that's amazing, I can't even believe that happened. That's my goal, is to get those little stories out. And so in everything I do, I will drop in little tidbits of history. Even in the nonfiction book I wrote, The History of St. Louis Writers Guild, I put in my favorite fact of the whole book is that you used to, in 1920, they stopped allowing you to send children through the mail.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was just terrible. People
It
can't
is.
do that
So-
What is
anymore.
an easy way
Yeah.
to do it?
I know, but you just stick a couple of stamps on a kid,
Did
put
you
them
not
out.
know
The
this?
mailman would come by and scoop up your kid and take him off, and then you just get handed off and handed off, and then
But
land at grandma's.
But if you think about Jane Austen, like, they used to travel by post, right? So they would catch the same stagecoach
Yep.
that was taking the mail. So
Yeah.
it makes sense that you would
There'd be some
maybe
kids in the
treat
back.
it like
Yep.
Yeah, post your kid.
Yep, you could just
The
stick, and you
earliest
would
computer
pin. You'd have
ever.
to pin the postage to the kid, so you have to pin the postage on their clothes. And then you
What
just
a
talk to the
different-
mailman, and they go off, and mailman
know.
bring them back.
It
I
is.
know, right? But in 1920, they stopped this. But I love doing that. Like, that's my favorite thing. Even in a nonfiction book that's about the history of St. Louis Writers Guild, I still had to find ways of just telling you these little amazing tidbits of history. That's
great.
That's how it really affects
So-
my writing.
I want a
So,
picture
Brad, you
book
told us-
about a kid who's been mailed somewhere.
There is one.
That is a story.
Oh,
That is definitely a
okay.
story.
It's already been done. But I'm sure
Don't
there's
you
probably
think
time for an
Stephanie
update.
and I would snatch that gem up?
It's been done. So, Brad, you told us a little bit about how you got to where you are today. Can you tell us now what you're doing? Who are you publishing with? How are you publishing? I'm curious about your short stories and where are they appearing? Where can we read you?
So right now, the last few books that I've put out have all been indie published myself. As I come from a publishing background, the real thing that taught me was how to publish books. And because of that, I now just do that same process. Everything that I would do for one of my authors, I now do for myself. From book covers to the interior designs. And I get obsessive about it too. I love to make interior art and put interior designs in the book. I love doing that kind of stuff, like making the book really beautiful. So because of that, I'll admit I am a control freak and I love indie publishing.
Good for you.
That's
I love that
great.
you admit that. Congratulations, Brad.
Thank you.
No,
Yeah,
honestly.
I think that's exciting.
Yes.
And it allows me that modicum of control. And for right now, like the last book I published, I did try and get a publisher for it. I did. But it's a niche book. It's historical fiction. It's about something that took place. It was the 120th anniversary. So if it had been the 100th anniversary, maybe somebody would have picked it up. But nobody was really that interested in a book about this little chapter of American history. But I know there's a ton of readers out there who would love to read this book.
Yeah.
I can do the same thing that a small press could do for me. So because of that, I'm a fan of indie publishing.
That's great.
I'm not against traditional publishing, though. The next book that I'm working on right now, you're asking about what I'm doing. One of the things
Yes.
I'm doing is getting a literary novel that I've been working on for a very long time that actually started as a play. I wrote it as a play, and then I went back and forth, and I couldn't do anything with the play. But now it's a novel, and that I will totally be trying to get representation for, and also try and get a publisher for, because I feel that it's marketable, it's good enough, and there's an audience for it, so there might be somebody who wants to publish it. And if not, I always know I can fall back on indie publishing, and I know it will find an audience and a core there. That's the nice thing. I love all the avenues of publishing, that there's so many. I have
too.
been hybrid before, where I've been published by houses and publishing myself at the same time, so I'm a big fan of that. You asked about my short stories. All of them are simply thrown up onto Amazon. So for my books and stuff, I use Ingram Spark, and I use a distributor because I want that distribution as far as it can go. Every bookstore that I can get in, all that kind of stuff. But for these little short stories that I publish, it's just simply up on Amazon. I get them 99 cents on the ebook, and they find a good home. And I've found short reads have worked on Amazon for various things, but what I really love them for is add-ons on my table. So my short stories are in print, and you can get them at my table, and I get a lot of times I'll sell a book and a short story, and then I'm way closer to that $20 mark and not having to hand out as much change. And so I love that. I love it as an add-on at my table. I love my short stories for that. But really what I've found is they're a gateway into the rest of my writing. They're not all, some of them are steampunk, some of them are fiction, some of them are fantasy, some of them are sci-fi. But I've found a lot of people will read one of those and then go in deeper and start reading more and more of my backlist. So I get people with each book I release, but I also get people with each short story I release.
That's great. It's quick and digestible, and sometimes that's what people want.
Yeah.
They're not into novels. They want the bite size on the way to work, on the subway, or audiobook, or whatever it is. So That's
Exactly.
great. And I've seen your books. They are gorgeous. And you can tell the attention to detail and that
Well,
you care
thanks.
about it. And
I'm a fan of my latest one. I put this picture, and it looks like a journal. It looks like a leather journal. So
Yes. No,
yeah, I'm a
it's
fan of
neat.
that one.
It's very attractive. Okay, so we could sit and talk about history all day, I feel like here, but we do want to hear about story graphing.
Yes.
And how did you come across this concept? And can you explain for those of us who are never familiar with it, and how does it differ from like traditional story outlining? Do you still do that as well, or does this take the place of it?
So no, it is not. It doesn't replace anything. And big caveat right here: this is not a magic wand. It will not make your writing awesome and better. As I like to say, it is a tool for your toolbox, and that's about it. I love this because it brings in not only history, but also my love of kind of numbers and weird things like that. But I'm an outliner. I love my outlines. I'm a huge fan of them. When I sit down to write, I want to know everything that's going to be happening in that chapter before I sit down. Because then I don't have to think about what's happening as I'm typing. So I find that works really well for me, and it allows me to work through the story and see it, and it's that seeing. I'm a very visual person, and the outline allowed me to see the book, the 100,000 words, in a couple of pages. Story graphing allows me to see the whole book in a single image. And that's why I love it. I found it in the most unique way. I teach a workshop for young writers, which is about the basics of storytelling. And in there, I have a graph that is that basic kind of hill shape that we all know. It starts down here, you have rising action, you reach a climax, and then there's a little bit of descending action that comes after that. That is the most basic story you can tell. As I like to say, it's every short story out there. Because you're just rising straight up to a climax, and there's a little bit at the end. It's a very straightforward story. That is a graph of a story, and in searching for that, I came across Kurt Vonnegut's story graphing. Kurt Vonnegut, great American author. You can love him or hate him, however you want to play that, but
or a little of both.
He had this when he was alive. He's passed away since then. He had this thing on story graphing, and he would go up to the blackboard and he would draw this kind of elaborate graph, and he starts with Cinderella. It starts off, you have your vertical line and your horizontal line, and the vertical line represents the good and the bad, and the horizontal line represents the beginning and end of your story. Obviously, Cinderella starts below because she's not doing the best. Her mother's passed away. Dad's got this new wife. She's not really cool. So it starts very much in kind of a low place. Little things start to tick up, depending upon which Cinderella you want to go with. She makes mice friends who make her a cool dress. Then her sisters tear that dress apart, but there's a little bit of a downturn. But she gets a fairy godmother, she gets the cool dress, she gets the awesome shoes, she dances with the prince at the ball. Very cool things. Midnight happens and you get that drop. And then you get that slow turn up as her sisters chop their feet off to try and fit them in the shoe. And then you go all the way up to bliss, as he likes to put it, at the very end. Total bliss, where she's happy forever after. He lays this out, and then he goes on to talk about how there are other graphs as well. So there's the man in the hole, which is where you start off really high, and then something tragic happens, and you go down, and then the story becomes about getting them back up here. You've got the unmoving one. It's just a flat line. He equates, I think it's Macbeth to that. But with a character, no, it's Kafka, sorry. Kafka, where the character doesn't change throughout the entire story in terms of the story arc is just a very flat line. And these are all very cool, and you can go out there. There's a whole thing. There's some wonderful graphics, actually, that lay out each one of his depictions of a story, and there's 6 or 8 of them. And he was basically like, all stories fall into these graphs. That's where we differ. So I look at this now as an author and as someone who's looking for a way to visualize my stories. And what I see is, this is a genre. In fact, Cinderella is the exact same shape as Star Wars. So you start off with a young boy who's suddenly having some tragicness of his aunt and uncle dying, and then some things start to pick up because he meets this cool old guy. Then that old guy dies, and there's a little bit of a dip, but, oh, okay, we keep going, and finally, in the end, we defeat the Death Star, and that's bliss.
I feel like we should have said spoiler alert.
It's a really old movie, no. But, so because of that, I'm like, these are genres. So what he's talking about here isn't that every story falls into these. It's that different genres take on different shapes. And when you look at it in terms of that, you'll notice that the descending story, which is basically Romeo and Juliet. So they start off here and then they go up high because they're suddenly in love and standing on balconies and all that kind of stuff. And then they start to dip as Tybalt dies and the families hate them and all the craziness that comes over from that. And then in the end, it never goes up because the two characters die. And it ends tragically down there. And I'm like, okay, that's every tragedy you've ever known. And you can see that. And a literary novel loves to just give that little bump at the end where there's just that little slight bit of hope. And I started to notice that. And then I was wondering, if I take this principle and I add it to my own books, what really happens there? And that's when I started graphing my own books. And I realized that the point of story graphing isn't just the main plot. That's one thing you can look at, and it's amazing to do, and it really helps you look at your story because you start to see these peaks and valleys as good things and bad things happen in your story. I'm talking about that, but there's a graph of Harry Potter. And Harry Potter is literally just looks like a series of hills and valleys. It's a series of man in the holes, followed by a redemption arcs, followed by like all these kinds of different things as they overcome Voldemort or whatever the...
He who shall not be named.
Exactly. So as you look at these kinds of stories, I realized that you could plot these things out. And then so I'd already written my trilogy at this point when I'm looking at this. And I graphed that. And when you look at that graph, it's fascinating because there's a few things that come out of it. One, if you look at the graph of my main characters, like Alexander, my main character, his arc through the book, which mirrors the main plot. It's not exact because there are different things that happen. Sometimes something bad will happen in the plot. That's a dip in the plot. But to my character, it's a rising moment for him as he faces adversity or whatever is coming of that. So you'll see there's slight differences in the graph. There's also slight differences between my secondary character and my main character, though they're very similar. But there's little things that are different because she doesn't change as much as my main character. And then you have the villains. And I love villain arcs because they start high and end low, whereas usually it's the inverse of that. And so in doing this, what I realized is, in terms of plotting, you can do this ahead of your book to see what works and what doesn't work, because what you're looking for are peaks and valleys. And if you see a flat line anywhere, that's bad, because that means nothing happened. As you graph, it's entirely subjective. There's a lot of papers on how Vonnegut's wrong, because there's no way to scientifically apply his work. It's all subjective. And it is. It's entirely subjective. But if you place the same values, it's all about relativity to how you want to place it. So as long as you know the values you're doing, and what it means is, at the next point of the story, the next bar of the graph, the next point, is that higher or lower than where your character was? Are they better off or are they worse off? Are they more emotionally stable or are they less emotionally stable? And in doing that, you start to see these peaks and valleys. It's a rising moment for them. It's exciting. Yay. It's a low moment for them. Boo. There's bad things happening. In those peaks and valleys, you start to see that kind of roller coaster that we talk about and pacing and all that. But what you don't want to see is that flat line, because that flat line means nothing happened. And if nothing's happening in your story, you're seeing the muddy middle appear right there in your book. And you can just find those little spots, these little flat tops, and those are the points of your story that probably need work. And that's the real magic of story graphing, is that it lets you see the problems of your book in a visual form.
Brad, can you share the graph you have of your book
definitely.
One? And if you're only listening audio, you can go to the show notes and there will be links to these graphs that you can go look at if you're not on video also. But just for those of us that are visual learners, we'll get a look at the visual.
Okay. Are you guys seeing this?
Yes.
Excellent. You can also go over to my website. I'm sure you're going to put it in with the notes, but you can go over to my website at bradrcooked.com/workshops. It's my workshop page. I also have these graphs there. So these are essentially what I'm talking about here. And these are 4 graphs of the same book. So this is my first steampunk novel, The Iron Horseman, which is book 1 of the Iron Chronicles trilogy. But as you can see, the top 2 graphs are my 2 main characters, and the bottom graph is my main plot and my villains. And these are simply ways, and I will tell you, the more dots you use, the more information, the more accurate your graph is. So I'm not exactly certain how many are here.
Brad, when you say dots, do you mean like the more points in your story that you analyze?
Yes. So you can measure different things. The easiest way to do it is chapter by chapter. In the next chapter, are they better off or worse off than they were before? Are they more emotionally stable, less emotionally stable? And I will often do my character arc and my emotional arc of the book because they're very different, but they're similar. I have another graph I'll totally show you where it shows the emotional arc and the main plot. But this is the main plot mixed in with the characters, the 2 characters' emotional, it's their emotional plots up top, and then the main plot and the villain's main plot. And the reason I did this is, as you can see, the villains would be a horrible story. It's got all these flat lines, and it's got all these massive fluctuations. That's not what you're looking for. You're looking for something that builds. I was talking about that standard kind of look of the simple hill. It's that basic graph of everything. This applies to that. It's essentially that, but it's got more peaks and valleys in it because more things happen. And I will say here, so I wrote this book, as I said, before I was storygraphing. And if I had, you can see the 2 flat plateaus in Alexander and Genevieve's arcs. They're right there at the top. There goes that little flat line. If I was doing this now, I would know to go back there and tweak it a little so that I could give it a peak or a valley right there. Because what that shows is that Alexander, my main character, for 2 chapters or 2 or 3 plot points in the book, because that's what these are. These aren't chapter by chapter. This is point by point through the plot. That's another way of doing it. You can also go I like point by point through the plot because that lets me know what's happening next. So they're getting on an airship now. That airship's going somewhere. What are they doing while they're on the airship? He's training. And so that big uprise is the beginning of the story where he starts training and he starts getting confidence and he starts learning to be not just a 16-year-old kid, but more of a young adult. And so that's what that big rise is. And Genevieve's doing the same thing at the same time. So that's why they have those kind of 2 big arcs that go up like that. But you can see that these peaks and valleys and the way that it goes, and obviously it ends up higher because in my stories at least, at the end of them, the character tends to be better off and being victorious. So life is better at the end of the book than it was at the beginning of the book, and that's represented by that graph. The way these overlap, though, you can see, and these are point by point, so each point of the graph is the same. So if you were to overlay them, you can see where these things match up. And what you'll find is a lot of the times where the emotional peak and the plot peak at the same time, that's a key moment of your book. And this dot that you see here, that's the peak, the mid-peak of my book, that's the first climax, the peak of the book where everything's coming together. And then there's some tragedy that happens after that, and then they build up. But I've noticed that where you have an emotional peak and a plot peak, that's usually a really strong moment of your book. That's the moment people are going to talk about. And then the same thing goes for a valley. So where the emotional valley hits the plot point valley, that's also usually a moment, the emotional low moment of your book or something like that. And you can just start to see these things. And the villain's arc, I will tell you, never looks right because rarely do they grow, and they're just there for cannon fodder. So they tend to have arcs that are either, yay, we're defeating the main character, or bummer, we're being defeated by the main character. And obviously, they lose in the end, so it's way down there at the bottom.
So is the climax in your 3rd act, will that then be the highest point?
Yes.
Okay.
So, in fact, actually, if I have a graph that is all 3 of my novels, the main plots of all 3 of my novels. And it's fascinating because it's a total, book 1 is down here, book 2 sits here, and book 3 sits up here. And I was fascinated the way that worked. Even though there's bad things that happen in book 3, because it's the climax of everything in the trilogy, there's a lot of peaks. and a lot of kind of sitting high. And I really did notice the way that it went. It's fascinating the way that you can see these stories unveil themselves. The other thing I learned was that the 3 books are written very similarly. They all had very similar arcs until you got to the 3rd book, which then had a bit of a different ending to the graph. But it was amazing to me because what it really taught me was I'm a little formulaic. At least in this trilogy, the 3 books are written in the same way. So they had very similar graphs.
So when you're working with the graphs, you're taking into account where you want to have the peaks and valleys. When you say you're graphing each point, are you saying that you're just on your level in your mind, you're like, it goes up just like a notch?
So it's
or a notch.
Yes.
So what is it you're actually graphing when you?
If you take, so this is like 23 or 26 points of my novel. It does not actually include the end because once they made it to New York, I was like, I didn't need to graph anymore. So this is just the beginning of the book to New York. But essentially, each point is the next step that they do in the book. From starting in San Francisco to then starting off, they drive out into California and stuff like that. So the next point is just whether or not what they're doing next in the story. The value comes in how much does that fluctuate from the moment before. Is it a +1? Is it a +5? Is it? And here's what I say.
That's my question.
Limit it to +5 and -5 because you don't need a million points and like half points and all this kind of. I do half points in this one though, because I wanted a tighter data set so I could have a little bit more of a roller coaster looking. And then as you move forward, the next point you're relating it to the point that just happened. So is it better or worse? And how worse? Is it -1 and a -3? But you have to know that -5, or in my case, I do -3 and +5 because the negatives in my books, because these are all mostly for young adults, are not going to be as low as the high moments. It's just the way I structure these books. It's not the case with all my books, but with these books it is.
Okay, so really
But
you're coming up with your own, it's your own scale.
It's your
kinda like
own thing.
When you go to the doctor and they're like, according to, is this happy? Are you a 1? What's your pain level?
Exactly.
Are you
No,
at
it's
a
exactly.
5?
I
Okay,
equate it
so-
to whose line is it anyway? The points are made up and they don't matter. What matters is to you. The -3 is going to be the lowest moment of your book. So you can't have a ton of -3s or else your book is really depressing. You also can't have a total number 5 because number 5 is the highest point of your book. And then once you have those values, and I figure those values out first, I know that this is going to be the highest value in my book probably. I don't give it that dot yet. I wait till I actually get there in the graph. But once you're there, you're just evaluating that dot is either higher or lower than the one previous. Where they were in the plot. So in this plot, they're in Idaho, and then they're driving to the next place. Stuff happens along the way. They start to break down, and then they have these adversity that they then have to overcome, and then eventually they get the dog in Idaho, and that's a really high moment. And in fact, that middle high moment there in this graph is when Bud shows up and becomes a part of the crew and stuff like that. But this graph right here, and the reason I like it, is this is the main plot and the emotional plot mapped over. So this is the main plot of my story, which is, and this one is about the first road trip across America. And what I love about this graph is the blue is the main plot, and you can see that the emotional dots don't always hit up with that because my character isn't necessarily always thrilled about what he's doing. Sometimes he's very doubtful that he's going to be able to succeed, even though they do succeed. And you can see the difference that happens there. Even though, like, his emotional arc, in the beginning of the book, he's way, way down on himself, even though they're having this really awesome time and there's all these amazing things going on. So the plot's up here, but my main character's down here. And I don't normally do these graphings until I'm done with the book, because this is an editing tool for me. But you can use it as a way of plotting, figuring out as you go. I know there are some pantsers out there who will totally use this as a way of What if I made it better here? That's my graph would start to like peak here instead of over here. And they'll literally just adjust everything as they go. There's a way of seeing how it might work if there's a peak here, if they switch that up and get rid of that and they turn it into a valley. So there are ways you can use this for different ways of editing or different ways of outlining. But I find it best as an editing tool to help me see the novel. As you can see, this is a series of basically a man in the hole, according to Vonnegut, where there's a high that he experiences that then is tampered by this tragedy that he must overcome. And in fact, in this one, there are two of them. And what I find fascinating about this is not a plot I created. This is real life. I'm just telling an arc of a story where, I'm weaving it into this, overcoming the stuff that happened to them on the road. But the reality is that this is the arc of their story. So even in normal life, you can graph normal life because it will fall into these genres, which is why I say that the graphs are genres. They're not specific to stories. They're specific to types of stories.
Interesting. I really can see how this would really help in editing for me. So I like that. Can you use your graphing on writing nonfiction, straight nonfiction?
Okay, so the interesting thing about this book is I didn't make up this plot at all. Even though it's historical fiction, the only thing fiction in the entire book are the conversations that happen, which even those are mostly real because I pulled from the letters that the one guy wrote his wife. I just wrote the story as it happened. So that double man in the hole graph that's there, that's real life. So you could totally use this for nonfiction, for mysteries. I often get that Sam Spade, these people, they don't change, so this is all, not real. And my thing is, yes, there is that flatline storyline where your character does not change. And I equate this to any of your noir detectives. Rarely are they actually going to have major character growth in that story, because the whole point is that in the next story they have to be the same detective. But in the next story, Sam's going to know that the femme fatale might kill his partner. And so he's going to be less likely to trust the next femme fatale who comes into the office. So in that, there's slight growth. You'll generally have some sort of tragedy in the beginning of noir, and then you'll have something at the end where it wraps up. But I like to think that line at the very end is like that half tick or that 1 tick, that 1 point higher, because he's learned something. He's learned that the femme fatale is bad. Even if you think it's going to be a flat line, there's still going to be something, and that's just the emotional arc. Hopefully your plot, it never is flat. Because that would be a boring plot. If it's just a flat line, that means nothing's happening.
And real life is rarely flat.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not,
And maybe if you're writing nonfiction and you go to plot it and it is that straight line, either it needs to be fiction, or two, we as the writer need to still keep it factual, but give it extra layers, maybe.
Find some interest points.
Find a way to get that,
right.
Just bump it up to a 1, or drop it down to a -0.5, or something like that, because even if it's just a little thing happening, it doesn't have to be major movements. In fact, if you have giant swings where you're going from a 5 to a 3, and that's not the key emotional hardcore moment of your book, that's a problem. Because if you're having these hard swings in your book, that could be good in some genres, but for most of them, the reader's just going to be going back and forth. You want that build-up. You want some of those peaks and valleys. You want to see what's happening, and then you want something at the end, whether it's a high note or a low. It's all subjective, because A, it's about your story and what you want to tell and what you're doing, and B, it's about how you want to define the story. Is the story getting better or worse or whatever? It's entirely up to you. So you should never be like, oh, no, it has to graph this way. No, that's not the way this works. The graph should never tell you, like, oh, this is what you should be doing. The graph should be like, here's where you have an issue, and here's where you need to look. It's still you.
So Brad, what advice would you give to writers who are interested in experimenting with this story graphing for the first time?
First off, lay out your story, lay out the graph, put a bunch of dots on it and everything like that. Then figure out the points of your book that you want to graph. Whether that's chapter by chapter, whether that's point by point, whether that's...
Like scene by scene?
Scene by scene, exactly. In that case, then you start assigning... So you get a list of all of these things that happen, all the different scenes that happen in your book. And then you just start assigning them a value. So it's start off. Where do they start off? Because that's the most important one. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they in a good place? Are they in a sad place? My character starts off in a remarkable journey. He's a mechanic in California. He's not that bad off, but he's also not that happy. He wants to be a speed demon. He'd much rather be going fast than working on engines. He'd much rather be working on engines than working on bicycles and all this kind of stuff. He starts off at a half -1 or a -half or something like that. But that quickly changes as he gets this amazing offer from this guy to modify this car and take it across the country. So that totally starts upticking. So figure out where you start with that 1, -1, 0, however you want to do it. And then you just go to the next one. And where does your story go? My story goes up. It's a boop up and another boop up and another boop up. But it might be that you've got a bit of a downturn or however. Then you start assigning those. And then I look at them. And usually at that point I'll know what's the highest value. What's the climax of the book? So that one gets the 5. What's the lowest moment of the book? That one gets the -3. And then you start to just plot them out on the graph. It's very simple. Connect the dots. And I'll say you can do it any way you want. So I have done this as pen on paper. I have done this on Photoshop or any kind of drawing tool. And then Microsoft also has the graphing tool in Microsoft Word or in other things like that. Any of those will do. Yeah, Excel has it too. So you can find ways to make this graph so that you don't have to, do all the points. You can just create the list. Once you do that, though, and you plug it in, you get that, then you can see the graph. And once you see the graph, then you can start to look, okay, are there any flat points? Are there anything that needs to go up or down or anything like that? And it is entirely subjective, so you have to be true to yourself. You have to admit that the book is either getting better or worse, which then helps you to realize, it really helps you frame your mind of, I'm looking at it subjectively. I'm starting to look at the book not as the story, not as the words and the plot. You start to see the forest from the trees. And that, I think, is really helpful. For me, sometimes, to see that kind of macro view of my book. And that's what this is about. I find it really hard sometimes at 70, 100,000 words to get my mind around all that. And this puts it all in one little page right there in front of you.
And so then, from going back to the beginning, it sounds like what you do is you do the same exact thing for your main character's emotional arc, and you do the same thing for your secondary character's emotional arc.
Yep.
And you can do it for plot, and you can do it for all these things. And then it seems like if you overlay those, then you really start seeing
you will see your whole book laid out, and it's when you get
turning
that
points
final
and
graph that's like the emotional arcs, and you can get the subplots going in there. You can get, because I find sometimes you can do the subplots, you can do the main plots, you can do the character arcs, the villain arcs, the emotional arcs, all of these kinds of things. And when you overlay them, it'll be this mess. But that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for the points where they all intercede. So the points where those graphs all come together, they all are doing the same thing, means that you have done something right. Because that means that when these peaks all come together, those are important moments of your book where the emotional arc is meeting your main plot, and there's not any kind of conflict other than those, and you see it right there. It's 2 graph points coming together. And as long as it's all kind of making the same shape, that means the book is cohesive and makes sense and flows together. And the villain's arc will always be a little skewed and weird and everything like that. That's the one that you're really just looking for, those points where the villain intersects the main plot, the emotional arc, all of those kinds of things. That's what you're looking for, those, because when the villain's there too, that means that you've got that central core of that story. That's a moment.
And I love how you said that you see where it's working and that you've done something right. I think a lot of tools we use, it's always, what's wrong? You know what I mean? And I love that you naturally are like, look at what is working. And then what a remarkable way when it's time to revise and that's just staring at you to be like, this is a great place where I start because this right here is not working. So maybe I start there and it doesn't seem so huge. Not to mention, like you mentioned, marketability. Is this even going to be interesting, or are we just on this flat plane? And so that's awesome.
I find it remarkable for helping you find the muddy middle. So people always talk about it, this blah part of the middle of your book. You'll see it. It'll be flat lines. It'll be flat lines in the emotional arc. It'll be flat lines in the main plot. It'll be flat lines somewhere. Or it'll be these little weird bumps that don't make sense in the grand arc of your story. That's something to focus on. It just lets you know, boom, right there, that's where I need to go. So I do love it for that. But I also love it, and you're totally right, it tells you what you're doing right. You'll see where those points come together. And if you notice in the second graph, if you go online and see it or whatever, there are no flat points. There's not a single flat point in the book. Everything is either an up or a down. And that's what you're looking for. You want your story to be either improving, you want your characters to be getting better, or you want them to be getting worse. You never want them to just stay the same. And yes, some of your side characters, some of the secondary characters, they will have those. And that's okay. It's the main character that can't have that. It's the main plot that can't have that. But if you find those kind of lines in the secondary characters, or maybe even a subplot or something, maybe you need to look at it, but at the same time, the focus needs to be on the main character and the main plot.
This was so interesting and applicable. And no, my mind is just really wanting to get graphing. So, Brad, where can we find your books?
Oh, so you can order The Remarkable Journey of the First Road Trip Across America, which is the latest book. That is found everywhere. You can order it online from your favorite bookstore, or you can get signed copies at bradrcook.com. And then all of my short stories are on KDP and Kindle. They're all 99-cent ebooks.
Nice.
That's so fun.
I have a reading
you
list
so
now. I'm ready to go.
Oh, so great. Well, thank you so much for being with us,
No,
Brad.
thank you, yeah.
And thank you all. And we'll see you next time on Wayward Writers. Conquer your path.